The next time you're complaining that your lens isn't quite as fast as you'd like it to be, just be thankful you're not shooting a Zeiss Hologon 16mm. Back in 1990 something, Zeiss decided to reinvent a lens that they first designed in the 1960s. A lens that claimed to have extraordinary powers because it was in fact a 16mm lens with no distortion whatsoever. And I'm talking about a 16mm lens for a full frame film camera. In fact, it was designed for the Contax G2, a legendary rangefinder film camera that some still say is the best ever produced. Now, I know a 16mm lens doesn't sound very extraordinary these days. We're all used to ultra wide angles like 16mm because of the micro four thirds system, which uses just the centre of a 16mm lens to turn it into a 32mm, thus avoiding mass distortion. But this actually was a full frame 16mm semi fisheye, edge to edge, absolutely no distortion whatsoever. So how did it do that? Well, as I recall, they did it by making shooting with this lens the most convoluted, the most involved and the most difficult bit of photography I had ever had the misfortune to spend thousands of pounds on. And yes, it did cost thousands of pounds. For all intents and purposes, I found this lens virtually unusable. But if you could get a picture out of one of these, boy was it sharp. So why was it so hard to use? Well, first off, you had to attach a bulbous piece of glass to the camera. The front element was so round it protruded from the bow. There was no way you could fit a filter on it. So no use to landscape or black and white photographers then. Not on film anyway. And it wasn't just bulbous at the front, but at the back too. The rear element was actually inside the camera, right next to the shutter itself. It almost touched it. So being careful was lesson number one. Now this lens was an f8. Not the fastest you might think. But when I say f8, I don't mean f8 to f22 or 32 or even to 16. No, this didn't have a moving aperture at all. It was just f8, fixed at f8, always f8. So it wasn't great at low light. It wasn't even great at taking pictures indoors, as I recall. Not unless you were inside a blast furnace, that is. It needed a lot of light. So how on earth, at a 16mm full frame, did it manage to have absolutely no distortion? I frankly have no idea how it did it, but somehow it did. But only if you were good with the spirit level. Really? Yes, because the viewfinder had a spirit level inside it. When you looked through and composed your picture, the only way the image could be stopped from having distortion was if you got the bubble right bang in the centre of the spirit level. It really was the perfect camera for bricklayers. Now the Contax G2 that it was designed to fit on was a rangefinder. Trouble was, you couldn't use the 16mm lens with the camera's rangefinder. No, you had to attach the rangefinder that came with the lens. That's right, it actually had its own viewfinder. You attached it onto the camera's hot shoe. That was the only way that you could accurately compose a photograph. And that's where you'd find the spirit level. Now it was an autofocus camera, the G2, but the 16mm lens had to be focused manually. Although to be fair, you were mostly going to be on infinity anyway. However, if you did want to focus on an object a little bit nearer, there was only one way to really do it. You had to move your eye to the camera's viewfinder, half depress the shutter button, and then you would get a lock on the object and a distance reading. Then you take that distance reading and transfer it to the lens. The lens had actually got a small handle jutting out of the side. You moved that handle around and the lens barrel had markings with distances. You put the corresponding distance with the focus distance you wanted and hey presto. Now that sounds complicated enough, doesn't it? But it doesn't stop there. Oh no. No, because with all the technology that they've thrown at this lens, they still couldn't get rid of vignetting. Yeah, it had a vignetting problem. So how did they get round it? What was the solution? Well, believe it or not, the solution they came up with was to supply you with a filter that actually solved the vignetting problem, because it was a vignetting filter in reverse. That's right, it was a neutral density centre and clear on the edges at the exact same strength as the vignetting problem, which meant that once you slotted the filter into the lens, the vignetting was cured, albeit at the cost of 2 stops. That's right, you lost 2 stops of light with this filter. And the bad news didn't stop there, because some photographers reported the filter had a green cast when they used it with chrome film. I never saw it, but hey, who am I to judge? Geez, was this lens really worth using? Well, some thought it did. I don't know what glass they put into this, but by heck it must have been good, because even today these lenses are fetching over £1,000 on the second-hand market. So the next time you find yourself complaining that the autofocus is not quite quick enough on your lens, spare a thought for the Zeiss 16mm Hologon users, and maybe things might not seem so bad after all.